How do you conquer a continent in a flash? Not with brute force alone, but with a horrifyingly brilliant plan. In the late 1930s, Europe held its breath, teetering on the precipice of a war everyone feared but few could prevent. At the center of this storm stood one man whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness. But the first move he made was not one of war, but of diplomacy, a move so cynical it would shock the world. In August of 1939, the unthinkable happened. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two ideological archenemies, signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, it was a promise of peace. Secretly, it contained a protocol that was a death warrant for a sovereign nation. This pact wasn't just about carving up Poland, it was the key that would unlock the gates to a continental war. But what was its immediate, devastating consequence? On September 1st, 1939, the answer came. German forces stormed across the Polish border. This was not the static warfare of the past. This was something new, something terrifyingly fast. It was called Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. Columns of panzer tanks, supported by the screaming Stuka dive bombers of the Luftwaffe, shattered Polish defenses, creating chaos and paralysis. Just 17 days later, as part of their secret agreement, Soviet forces invaded from the east, sealing Poland's fate. The world watched in stunned silence as a nation was extinguished in weeks. But this was just a rehearsal. The real performance was yet to come. Where would the storm strike next? After a quiet winter, the so-called phony war, Hitler unleashed his war machine again in April of 1940. Denmark fell in hours. Norway was invaded to secure vital iron ore routes and preempt the British Royal Navy. With Scandinavia now under his thumb, all eyes turned to the west. France, with its massive army and the supposedly impenetrable Maginot Line, stood as the great bastion of European democracy. How could Germany possibly overcome such a formidable defense? The Allies expected a repeat of the First World War, a brutal slog through Belgium. They were catastrophically wrong. The German plan, Fall Gelb, was a stroke of strategic genius. The main armored thrust would not attack the strongest defenses head-on, but would instead drive through the dense, hilly, and supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. It was a gamble of epic proportions. The gamble paid off. German tanks poured out of the forest, bypassing the Maginot Line completely and racing for the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in two. Hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were trapped, leading to the desperate evacuation at Dunkirk. By June, Paris had fallen. In less than a year, Adolf Hitler had redrawn the map of Europe. From Warsaw to Paris, the swastika flag flew. He was the master of the continent. But across a narrow channel of water, one nation still stood alone, defiant, and its defiance would force Hitler into his first critical mistake. Had Britain fallen, the world as we know it would be unrecognizable. This wasn't just a battle, it was the hinge of history. The moment the tide of tyranny was finally impossibly turned. By the summer of 1940, the Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable. Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, all had fallen. From the coast of France, German soldiers could look across the 21 miles of the English Channel and see the white cliffs of Dover, the last bastion of a free Europe. Adolf Hitler was convinced that Britain, facing invasion and alone, would sue for peace. He was wrong. The plan was codenamed Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious invasion of Great Britain. But before a single German soldier could set foot on British soil, the skies had to be cleared. The formidable German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, under the command of Hermann Göring, was tasked with a singular objective: annihilate the Royal Air Force. But the British held a secret weapon, a revolutionary system of detection called radio direction finding, or radar. This, combined with the legendary Supermarine Spitfire and the rugged Hawker Hurricane, gave the defenders a fighting chance. But could this thin line of pilots and machines possibly stand against the most powerful air force the world had ever seen? The battle began not with a thunderclap, but with a slow grinding press. Throughout July, the Luftwaffe targeted British shipping in the Channel, attempting to lure the Royal Air Force fighters into a battle of attrition. This was the Kanalkampf, the Channel Battle, and it was only a prelude to the real storm. On August 13, 1940, the main assault began. Adlertag, Eagle Day. Over 1,400 German aircraft swarmed across the Channel, their targets now the airfields and radar stations of Fighter Command. The goal was to smash the Royal Air Force on the ground and in the air, to break its back in a matter of days. The fighting was savage, a maelstrom of machine gun fire and cannon shells in the skies over southern England. Day after day, the Luftwaffe came. Day after day, the pilots of the Royal Air Force, outnumbered and exhausted, rose to meet them. The attacks were relentless. The Royal Air Force was bleeding. How much longer could they possibly hold on? Then a single, seemingly minor event changed everything. Following a stray German bomb landing on London, the British launched a small retaliatory air raid on Berlin. The damage was minimal, but the psychological impact on Hitler was immense. In a fit of rage, he ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its focus. He would terrorize the British people into submission. This was a catastrophic error. By turning away from the battered airfields, Göring gave Fighter Command the one thing it desperately needed: a reprieve. As London burned under the nightly horror of the Blitz, the airfields were repaired. New planes were delivered, and the exhausted pilots, who were on the verge of collapse, were given a chance to rest, rearm, and fight again. The Germans, however, believed the Royal Air Force was broken. And so on September 15th, the Luftwaffe prepared for what it believed would be the final decisive blow. Nearly 1,500 aircraft were launched in two massive waves against London, a knockout punch designed to end the battle once and for all. But as the German bomber fleets approached the capital, they were met not by a shattered remnant, but by a sky full of Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Royal Air Force had weathered the storm. The ensuing combat was the largest and most decisive of the entire battle. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had suffered losses it simply could not sustain. 2 days later, Hitler quietly, indefinitely, postponed Operation Sea Lion. He had failed. The invasion was off. The Battle of Britain was over. It was the first major defeat of the German war machine, a crack in the myth of Nazi invincibility. Britain would remain a fortress, a staging ground for the eventual liberation of a continent. It was won by a complex system of command and control, by technological innovation, and by the courage of pilots from across the Commonwealth and a dozen other nations. As Winston Churchill would say, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Forget D-Day. Forget Pearl Harbor. The true hinge of fate in World War II was this single, audacious and ultimately suicidal decision by Hitler. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, the largest invasion force in human history stirred in the darkness. 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and a sky full of aircraft were poised to shatter a fragile peace. At the time, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were allies, bound by a non-aggression pact that had allowed them to carve up Poland between them. But why would Hitler, at the very peak of his power, risk a two-front war? The answer lies in a toxic brew of ideology, hubris, and a profound underestimation of his enemy. For Hitler, this was not just a war for territory, it was a crusade. He sought Lebensraum, living space for the German people, and viewed the Slavic populations of the East as subhuman, destined for enslavement or extermination. He saw the Soviet Union as a colossus with feet of clay, a rotten structure he believed would collapse with a single, swift kick. But what if that structure wasn't rotten, but forged from something far harder? Operation Barbarossa, as the invasion was codenamed, began with stunning success. German panzer divisions tore through the unprepared Soviet lines. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were encircled and captured in vast pockets. Stalin, in a state of shock, initially refused to believe the reports, convinced it was a mere provocation. The German war machine seemed invincible, an unstoppable force of nature rolling across the endless plains. But even as they celebrated these early victories, a fatal flaw was already revealing itself. What invisible enemy was already beginning to bleed the German army dry? The sheer scale of the Soviet Union was a weapon in itself. For every mile the Germans advanced, their supply lines stretched thinner and thinner, becoming vulnerable. The resistance, both from the military and from civilian partisans, was far more ferocious than anticipated. Then came the first great strategic blunder. A bitter argument erupted between Hitler and his generals. They wanted to drive straight for Moscow, the heart and brain of the Soviet state. Hitler, however, overruled them, diverting Army Group Center south to secure the rich resources of Ukraine. This decision would cost them precious, irreplaceable weeks. And in Russia, the calendar is not just a May. As the German spearheads were bogged down in battles for cities like Kiev and later Oral, the summer sun began to wane. The autumn rains turned the roads into impassable rivers of mud, and on the horizon, the first signs of the true enemy were beginning to appear: General Winter. This wasn't merely a defeat. It was the chilling forecast of an empire's doom, written in the snows of Russia. In the summer of 1941, the German war machine appeared unstoppable, a steel juggernaut that had crushed nations under its treads. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was meant to be the final, glorious campaign, a swift victory to seal Adolf Hitler's mastery over Europe. But as the weeks turned into months, and the golden autumn fields gave way to a featureless white expanse, a horrifying new reality began to dawn on the German High Command. Army Group Center, the spearhead aimed at the heart of the Soviet state, pushed relentlessly towards Moscow. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured in vast pockets. Victories that seemed to confirm the German doctrine of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Yet, the very scale of their success was becoming a liability, with supply lines stretched for 1,000 miles, thin and vulnerable. And then the muds of the Rasputitsa began, a sea of mire that choked engines and swallowed vehicles whole, a prelude to an even more formidable adversary. The Germans had gambled on a short war. Their soldiers had no winter clothing. Their lubricants froze solid in the sub-zero temperatures, and their weapons simply ceased to function. Temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius, an alien cold that shattered the morale of men who had believed themselves invincible. Frostbite claimed more casualties than combat as soldiers huddled in shallow trenches, their summer uniforms offering no protection against the Siberian wind. But the cold was only half the enemy. For as the Germans froze, the Soviets were preparing a counterstroke, a blow forged in the depths of their own national winter. Stalin, having received intelligence that Japan would not attack from the east, unleashed his secret weapon, dozens of fresh, well-equipped divisions from Siberia. These men were accustomed to the brutal cold, dressed in warm winter gear, and fiercely motivated to defend their capital. On December 5, 1941, as German soldiers could literally see the spires of the Kremlin in their binoculars, the Red Army struck back. The shock was absolute. The hunters had suddenly, violently become the hunted. The German advance was not just halted, it was thrown back, in some places over 100 miles, a humiliating retreat. For the first time in World War II, the German army was dealt a strategic defeat from which it would never fully recover. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was shattered in the frozen wasteland before Moscow. The war in the East would not be a swift campaign, but a grueling, monstrous war of attrition. It was here, at the gates of the capital, that the tide began to turn, and the long, bloody road to Berlin truly began. Why did Hitler gamble everything on this one frozen hellscape? The answer changed the world forever. The summer of 1942. On the vast plains of southern Russia, the German war machine seemed an unstoppable force of nature. Operation Blue, Hitler's grand offensive, was designed to seize the vital Caucasus oil fields and bleed the Soviet Union dry. One city, a sprawling industrial center on the Volga River, stood in the way. Its name was Stalingrad. Initially, it was just a name on a map, a stepping stone to a greater prize. But for Adolf Hitler, it became an obsession. The city bore the name of his arch-nemesis, Joseph Stalin. Taking it would be a symbolic victory of unparalleled magnitude. The strategic objective soon warped into a personal vendetta, and it was here that the first fatal error was made. The German Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, pushed into the city's suburbs in September. The Luftwaffe unleashed a firestorm, bombing Stalingrad into a twisted skeleton of rubble and ash. They believed the city would fall in days, but they had unintentionally created the perfect fortress for the defenders. The battle devolved into a savage, close-quarters nightmare the Germans called Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Every building, every floor, every sewer tunnel became a battlefield. Soviet soldiers of the 62nd Army, under General Vasily Chuikov, vowed to make the Germans pay for every inch in blood. But as the Germans bled for the city, what was happening on their flanks? While the world watched the inferno in Stalingrad, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov was quietly assembling a force of over 1 million men. He saw the German obsession as a weakness. The Sixth Army's flanks, stretching for hundreds of miles, were held not by elite German troops, but by their much weaker Romanian and Italian allies. Zhukov planned not to relieve Stalingrad directly, but to encircle the entire German army attacking it. The plan was codenamed Operation Uranus. Could such an audacious gamble possibly succeed? On November 19th, 1942, in the midst of a blinding blizzard, the Soviet counteroffensive began. Two massive armored pincers smashed through the Romanian lines with terrifying force. The German commanders were caught completely by surprise. Within just 4 days, the trap snapped shut. At the town of Kalachna-Donu, Soviet tanks met, sealing the fate of the German Sixth Army. Nearly 300,000 men were now trapped, their supply lines cut deep inside hostile territory. General Paulus, realizing the catastrophic situation, pleaded with Hitler for permission to break out of the encirclement. But Hitler refused. The head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, made a disastrously optimistic promise. He swore his air force could supply the entire army from the air. Convinced, Hitler declared Stalingrad a fortress, ordering the Sixth Army to hold its ground at all costs. An entire army was now dependent on a lifeline from the sky. But would that lifeline ever truly arrive? The promised air bridge was a catastrophic failure. The brutal Russian winter, the infamous General Winter, descended with full fury. Temperatures plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius inside the pocket or Kessel. The situation became a true vision of hell. Ammunition ran low, food disappeared. The daily ration for a German soldier dwindled to a few ounces of bread. Men froze to death in their foxholes, succumbing to starvation, frostbite, and disease. The once mighty Sixth Army was being systematically annihilated, not just by the enemy, but by hunger and the cold. A German relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, was thrown back by the Soviets. The last glimmer of hope was extinguished. By January 1943, the pocket had been squeezed into 2 small, starving remnants. On January 31st, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a grim reminder that no German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus chose to live. He surrendered that same day. 2 days later, the last German forces laid down their arms. Of the nearly 300,000 men encircled, only about 91,000 survived to be taken prisoner. Very few would ever see Germany again. The Battle of Stalingrad was more than a defeat. It was an annihilation. It was the turning point of the Second World War on the Eastern Front. The myth of German invincibility was shattered forever in the rubble of that city. From the frozen banks of the Volga, the Red Army began its long, brutal march, a march that would end over 2 years later in the ruins of Berlin. Hitler's obsession with one city, his refusal to accept reality, had not only cost him an entire army, but had sealed the ultimate fate of his 1,000-year Reich. The road to downfall began here. The chilling truth: Hitler's war was lost before it truly began. The numbers don't lie, and they are terrifying. In the early years of World War II, the Blitzkrieg seemed to rewrite the rules of conflict. Nation after nation fell. But this was a war of sprints, and a marathon was looming. Wars are not won by tactical genius alone. They are won with steel, with oil, with an unending river of material. They are won with industry. And while Germany's industry was formidable, it was built on a foundation of sand, about to be washed away by a rising tide. What was this fatal miscalculation? The Third Reich's economy was designed for short, sharp wars of conquest. It was never prepared for a global conflict of attrition. By 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler had made a fatal wager, betting everything on a victory that had to come within months. But why was this such a critical error? Because across the Atlantic Ocean, a sleeping giant was stirring. The United States, with its colossal industrial base, was not yet a combatant, but its factories were already coming to life, fueled by acts like the Lend-Lease program. This was a declaration of industrial war, promising to make America the arsenal of democracy, while American trucks and planes provided a lifeline. What the Soviets were doing within their own borders was perhaps even more astounding. As German armies advanced, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics performed an act of almost unimaginable scale. They dismantled over 1,500 large industrial plants, put them on 20,000 trains, and moved them hundreds of miles east, beyond the Ural Mountains. While German generals begged for more Panther tanks, Soviet factories, now safe from bombers, began to churn out the rugged T-34 in staggering quantities. They weren't always as refined, but there were always more of them. Consider the sheer scale. In the single year of 1944, the Allies produced over 100,000 combat aircraft. Germany produced less than half of that. This wasn't a battle of soldier against soldier anymore. It was a battle of factory against factory. Every German tank destroyed was a grievous loss. For the Allies, it was a statistic, soon to be replaced by 3 more rolling off an assembly line in Detroit or Chelyabinsk. The War of Lightning had become a slow, grinding war of numbers. And in that war, the final outcome was never truly in doubt. The gears of a global machine, turning in unison, were grinding the Third Reich into dust. Forget Stalingrad. Forget the Ardennes. The true death knell for the Third Reich was not a single battle, but a strategic vice-tightening, first in Africa, then in Italy. The numbers do not lie. For every tank lost on the vast steppes of the Soviet Union, another was burning under the relentless African sun, a loss the Reich simply could not afford. This was not a sideshow. It was a slow, agonizing bleed on fronts Hitler disastrously underestimated, and it all began with a decision born of hubris and a desperate gamble to save a faltering ally. The year is 1942. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, has pushed the British Commonwealth forces to the brink. But across the Atlantic, a massive force was gathering, a secret army poised to strike not at Europe, but at the soft underbelly of the Axis. Operation Torch. The American entry into the war against Germany was not in the field of France, but on the beaches of Morocco and Algeria. Hitler now faced an impossible choice: reinforce Africa and weaken the Eastern Front, or abandon an entire continent and his Italian allies to their fate. What would he choose? He chose to double down. Pouring elite troops, panzers, and the Luftwaffe's finest into Tunisia, he sought a decisive victory. But in doing so, he had only created a trap for his own men. From the west, the Americans and British pushed. From the east, Montgomery's 8th Army, victorious at El Alamein, closed in. The Africa Corps was caught. By May of 1943, the Axis forces surrendered. The numbers were staggering. Over 250,000 veteran German and Italian soldiers were marched into captivity. It was a disaster on the scale of Stalingrad, yet it is often relegated to a footnote in history. But for Germany, a massive, irreplaceable hole had been torn in its strategic reserves. With Africa secured, the Allies looked north across the waves. The Mediterranean was now an Allied lake, and the next stepping stone was obvious and terrifyingly close. Operation Husky, The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 was the largest amphibious operation in history up to that point. The effect on Italy was immediate. Mussolini was deposed and arrested. The fascist regime crumbled before the first Allied soldier set foot on the mainland. But Hitler would not let Italy go. He saw the Italian peninsula not as a lost cause, but as a new fortress, a place to bleed the Allies for every inch of ground. He unleashed a brutal occupation and rushed his toughest division south. The soft underbelly proved to be anything but. Mountains, rivers, and fortified German positions like the Gustav Line turned the campaign into a brutal, grinding slog. Anzio, Monte Cassino, names that became synonymous with attritional warfare at its worst. For nearly 2 years, German division after division was fed into the Italian meat grinder. These were veteran units that could have been in France to meet the D-Day landings. They could have been on the Eastern Front trying to stem the Soviet tide. Instead, they were pinned down, fighting a costly defensive war they could not win, buying time that Germany no longer had. The path to Berlin was long and bloody, but it was paved in part on the sands of North Africa and in the mountain passes of Italy. Here, the Reich's ambition met the reality of its limitations. The Weiss, set in 1942, had finally, inexorably, crushed the life from the Third Reich. Hope arrived on waves of blood, the brutal reality behind the greatest invasion in history. By the spring of 1944, the shadow of the Third Reich had darkened Europe for 5 long years. From the shores of France to the vast plains of Russia, a fortress seemed impenetrable. But across the narrow English Channel, the largest military force ever assembled was preparing to gamble everything on a single day. Their plan was audacious, complex, and hinged on deceiving one man, Adolf Hitler. But how do you fool a dictator who trusts no one? The Allies called it Operation Fortitude. It was the greatest deception in the history of warfare. An entire phantom army, the first United States Army group, was conjured into existence in southeast England. Inflatable tanks shimmered in the fields, wooden aircraft lined fake runways, and a web of false radio signals was spun to convince German intelligence that the main assault would strike at the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. The fate of the free world rested on this elaborate stage play. But would the Führer take the bait? In the dark, pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944, the air over Normandy filled with the roar of engines. Over 24,000 airborne troopers from the United States, Britain, and Canada descended into chaos, tasked with seizing bridges and crossroads behind enemy lines. As dawn threatened to break, a ghost-like armada of nearly 7,000 vessels materialized off the French coast. On board, hundreds of thousands of young men waited, contemplating the thin line between life and death. The German defenders, peering through the morning haze, could not possibly comprehend the scale of the steel tidal wave about to crash upon them. But for the men designated for one particular stretch of sand, the day would become a synonym for hell itself. On the beaches, codenamed Gold, Juno, Sword, and Utah, the fighting was savage, but the objectives were largely taken. Then there was Omaha. The preliminary naval and air bombardment had utterly failed, leaving the German defenses untouched. As the ramps of the landing craft dropped, the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were met with a storm of machine gun fire and artillery. They died in the surf, on the sand and huddled behind the few obstacles that offered any cover. For hours, the invasion teetered on the brink of catastrophic failure. What turned the tide was not a grand strategy, but the desperate courage of small groups of soldiers who clawed their way up the bluffs and began the slow, bloody work of silencing the guns. Miles away, in his mountain retreat, Adolf Hitler slept. His generals, paralyzed by fear, dared not wake him. When he finally rose, late in the morning, he dismissed the Normandy landings as a mere diversion. Convinced that Operation Fortitude was real, he made a decision that would seal the fate of his empire. He refused to release the powerful panzer divisions held in reserve near Calais. This single, catastrophic miscalculation gave the Allies the priceless gift of time. Time to land more men, more tanks, more supplies, and to carve out a permanent foothold in Fortress Europe. The beachhead was secure, but now the invaders found themselves mired in a landscape that turned every field into a fortress. They called it the bocage, a nightmarish maze of ancient hedgerows, thick earthen walls topped with dense vegetation that crisscrossed the Normandy countryside. It was a defender's paradise. The Allied advance slowed to a brutal crawl, a yard-by-yard battle of attrition where casualties mounted for every hedgerow taken. For 7 weeks, the armies bled in this green hell. Then, on July 25th, the Americans unleashed Operation Cobra. Thousands of bombers carpeted a narrow sector of the German lines, creating a breach through which the waiting armored divisions could finally pour. The breakout had begun, and with it, a chance to not just push the enemy back, but to annihilate him entirely. The German 7th Army, reeling from the breakout, began a disorganized retreat. Allied commanders saw a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to trap the entire force in a pincer movement near the town of Falaise. The resulting Falaise pocket became a charnel house, a killing ground where German forces were relentlessly pounded by artillery and air power. While many escaped the trap, their army was shattered as a fighting force. What followed was a stunning pursuit. The road to Paris was open. On August 25th, after 4 years of occupation, the French 2nd Armored Division and the American 4th Infantry Division entered the capital to scenes of ecstatic joy. The liberation was a moment of immense symbolic power. In less than 3 months, the Allies had gone from a tenuous foothold on a beach to the heart of France. But this lightning victory bred a dangerous sense of optimism, a belief that the war would be over by Christmas. From the bloody sands of Omaha to the jubilant crowds in Paris, the summer of 1944 had redrawn the map of the war. It was a campaign defined by meticulous planning, unimaginable bravery, and the fatal hubris of a dictator. The cost was staggering. Over 200,000 Allied casualties and an even greater number of German losses. Hope had indeed returned to Europe, but it had been purchased with the blood of a generation. And as the autumn rains began to fall, the exhausted Allied armies would discover that the final, most brutal chapters of the war were yet to be written. He saw armies that were not there. He ordered counterattacks that never happened. This is not just history, it is a descent into madness. April 1945. The symphony of destruction plays its final deafening crescendo over Berlin. Artillery shells from the Soviet Red Army fall like a steel rain, turning the capital of the Thousand-Year Reich into a smoldering ruin. 50 feet below the Chancellery, in the damp concrete confines of the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler was orchestrating a war that existed only in his mind. He moved pins on a map, representing divisions and armies that had long since been annihilated or had simply ceased to exist. But what happens when a commander's orders are sent into the void to soldiers who are only ghosts? His gaze would fixate on Army Detachment Steiner, a force he believed would smash through the Soviet lines and relieve the city. He would scream for updates, for progress reports on this phantom offensive. The generals in the room, men who had once trembled before him, now exchanged furtive, desperate glances. The terrible truth was dawning on them. The war was not only lost on the battlefield, it was being directed by a man who had completely lost touch with reality. This was not just a military collapse, it was a psychological one, echoing from the very top down. But how does a regime built on the myth of an infallible leader function when that leader has descended into delusion? Down in the bunker, a bizarre, macabre world persisted. Secretaries and officers went through the motions, a strange cocktail of fanatical loyalty, nihilistic despair, and sheer terror. They watched as their Führer, shaking and stooped, planned the defense of a city that was already gone, drawing up plans for a future that would never come. Then, on April 29th, with the sounds of Soviet machine guns just streets away, came the final, surreal acts. In a bizarre ceremony, he married his longtime companion, Eva Braun. He dictated his last will and his political testament, a final, rambling tirade blaming the world, blaming his own generals for the catastrophe he alone had unleashed. But what would be his very last command? The next day, on April 30th, the man who had plunged the world into the abyss, who had dreamed of reshaping continents, faced his own end. It was not in a blaze of glory on the battlefield, but in a small, private room, deep beneath the earth. A single gunshot. His dream of a world dominated by his will ended not with a bang heard around the world, but with a muffled shot in a concrete tomb, as the empire he built crumbled into dust and ash above him. This wasn't just defeat, it was self-annihilation. How did a global power guarantee its own genocide? In 1940, the German war machine seemed invincible. From the shores of France to the plains of Poland, the swastika flew, a symbol of brutal efficiency. But this empire, built on conquest and blood, contained the seeds of its own destruction from the very beginning. The question is not just how it fell, but why it was always destined to. With France defeated, only Great Britain stood defiant. Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe was tasked with breaking the Royal Air Force, paving the way for invasion, but a critical underestimation of British resolve and technology would turn the tide in the skies. What fatal assumption did the German High Command make about their enemy? With Britain still in the fight, Adolf Hitler made the most fateful decision of his life. He turned east. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million German soldiers surged into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was meant to be a swift campaign to crush the Red Army before winter. But the vastness of Russia and the sheer tenacity of its people would swallow the Wehrmacht whole. Thus could anything have saved them from the frozen hell that awaited? As the Eastern Front devolved into a brutal war of attrition, another world power was drawn into the conflict. On December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Hitler, in a move that still baffles historians, chose to declare war on the United States of America just 4 days later. he was not obligated to do so. Why would he commit such a colossal strategic blunder, effectively sealing his own fate? The industrial might of the United States began to fuel the Allied war effort, but the decisive battles were being fought in the blood-soaked snow of the Soviet Union. The city of Stalingrad became a symbol of this titanic struggle. The German Sixth Army, surrounded and starving, was forbidden to retreat by Hitler himself. Its destruction in early 1943 was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological catastrophe. Yet Hitler believed he could still seize the initiative. He planned a massive offensive near the cities of Kursk and Orel. What followed would be the largest tank battle in human history and the final death blow to Germany's offensive capabilities in the East. The war was now a simple, brutal equation of production. Germany, fighting on two fronts with its cities being bombed into rubble, could not compete with the combined industrial output of the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States. Its own ideology was its greatest enemy. The genocidal policies diverted critical resources away from the war effort and towards mass murder. The system was not just immoral, it was pathologically inefficient. On June 6, 1944, the Western Allies finally landed in Normandy. The Wehrmacht was now caught in a closing vice, squeezed between the Soviets in the east and the Anglo-American forces in the west. The final year of the war was a relentless march towards Berlin, a Götterdämmerung of fire and destruction. But what was happening in the Führer's bunker as the world came crashing down? In the end, it wasn't just a defeat. It was a state-sponsored suicide. The hubris of a leader who saw himself as an infallible genius. The strategic insanity of declaring war on the entire industrialized world. And an ideology of hate that guaranteed its own destruction by prioritizing extermination over survival. The Third Reich, which was meant to last 1,000 years, collapsed in just 12, leaving behind a continent in ruins and a permanent scar on the conscience of humanity.